we must now ask ourselves, is it actually a failure of having meaningful partners in the world? Because let's be real. The president of the European Commission was here, and she was here to announce a new investment in South Africa. The president of France, Emmanuel Macron, was here not that long ago, a few years ago. These are two very big leaders in Europe who are asking the question, is America still a reliable partner? And that is a question we in South Africa must also begin asking ourselves. Is America a very reliable partner for us?
Welcome to Born Free, and to many of you, welcome to Misunderstood. My name is Kumalo. I am the founder and the co-host of the show. And today we're here to chat about politics. Mr. Otsile Nkadimeng, how are you doing?
I'm good. As good as can be, considering the times we live in.
Of course. I want to say a big shout out to the Mail and Guardian, first of all. Thank you for them bringing us on as a partner. This is a huge partnership for us. We hope to be giving you good information. We hope to be having good conversations, and we hope to be engaging politically, not only as young people, but also as true South Africans, something that's going to be interesting today. But yeah, I think today's episode was speaking about Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, or former ambassador now, which is very sad to say. Lot to think about, a lot's been said, but I want to kind of start at the beginning, when he got expelled for the statement that he made, particularly in a conference. What is your take on that statement? Because, I mean, we've spoken about this to some extent, but you say it was a very objective statement. I believe otherwise. Just for clarity, he mentioned that white people within the United States were becoming the minority as a result of the growing POC population. And he said that Donald Trump was then using race as a fundamental victimhood that he was creating around white people, and he was exporting this towards South Africa. What are your thoughts on that comment?
I mean, firstly, the ambassador was very frank and forthright when he said that. I don't think anyone looks at that statement and says there's anything inherently untrue about that statement. Giving voice to AfriForum and Solidaridad and their uninformed, misinformed mission to Washington. I think anyone that looks at this objectively says there's certain patterns that governments have to subscribe to when they're dealing with another state. The fact that for information, he's going to people like a Solidaridad and AfriForum, when our government has been saying repeatedly, both to the State Department and to the White House, listen, the information you're getting is wrong. Yeah. Let's talk through official channels here. But they want to use megaphone diplomacy. The ambassador was highlighting something that has been deeply frustrating for people within DIRCO, and that is that we're trying to talk to the Americans, but they don't seem to want to talk to us. They want to talk to these guys who are undertaking missions to Washington with no mandate from the public. They aren't the official representatives of South Africa. And where's the data for this information? He's giving rise to these voices that are very well established as voices for white supremacy in South Africa, or this notion that apartheid's ending was also the ending of any type of a positive, meaningful future for South Africa. I mean, we're seeing that dialogue take hold online right now. So the ambassador just said the quiet part out loud, and that is everything we've been noting coming out of the US, and that is this government's really been giving voice to these fringe elements that when we now want to talk officially, they're like, we don't hear you. We don't recognize you. We don't recognize your authority. The second component that I think the ambassador is also getting to there, and that's something that perhaps Pretoria is trying to avoid, is this confrontation that the US is trying to prompt with South Africa, and maybe we can unpack that later. And that's this thing that each and every single assault, the withdrawal of aid, the withdrawal of support, the issuing of these so-called refugee visas, all of them, one, done without consultation with the government, without talking to the government, and announced online, seemingly to do, and they do create public outrage. But I think the response Trump wants is for the president to get up and say, you bloody Americans and your nonsense. You know, they want him to have another, Robert Mugabe said to Tony Blair famously, you keep your Britain, I'll keep my Zimbabwe. They want the president to say that again, now especially, so that they can now say South Africa's in this, and now South Africa's an enemy, and then cause our allies, which and our partners who are also allies and partners of America in the EU, in many parts of Asia, to then pick sides. I think it's a deliberate effort to try sequester us into a corner, and I don't know what the end game is. I think that's the one thing that's racking everyone's mind right now. What's the end game?
Yeah, I think that very much stands true. But I think in many ways this is very quoted, because as we saw in the executive order, there was mention to the ICJ case, and there was mention to our stance on what we believe is a genocide in Israel that's currently taking place. And Israel's a very big ally of the United States, but more particularly Netanyahu seems to have a good allyship with Donald Trump. And I do believe in some level, on an international level, they do want South Africa to step back. They want us to take a step and say, actually, we're going to think about what we're doing, and we're going to consider more hardly whether or not we're going to engage American allies, and whether or not we're going to actually, in some ways, prosecute them for their wrongdoings and the humanitarian injustices that are taking place in many of the countries. I think the bigger concern for me and how this is all played out is a question on just national sovereignty, right? And the creating of your own laws and the ability to run a domestic country. Because what sparked all of this is the expropriation bill in South Africa. And to you and I, we very much know that that bill is quoted quite significantly in social justice, trying to refix for many of the apartheid injustices where land was taken from black populations. What's your take on that bill at the moment, and particularly how it's been related to the United States? Of course, you've recognized that there's been quite a lot of misinformation that's existed around it. But now, more particularly, now that we've had the conversation and we've had some time to look at that bill and people have come out speaking about that bill, where do you stand on it? Because Mfikile Mbalula, in his recent ANC opinion piece, he said that they were trying to just stop neocolonialism. And there's almost a level of imperialism that's being implemented by the United States, and them not allowing us to run our own sovereign nation and to be able to create our own laws. And of course, that has domestic implications, with the DA particularly not being in support of it and still contesting it quite significantly. But just as a platform and as a foundation for where this conflict has started, what's your thoughts on that, and what's your thoughts on America having such a good stronghold in South Africa at the moment and almost feeling like a partner in a government when they shouldn't be?
I mean, fundamentally, the expropriation bill was always going to be contentious.
Yeah.
To some extent, I feel like with that specific bill, we played into any planning of an onslaught against South Africa on the international stage from the US side, because it feeds into everything, the misinformed narrative that has been forming on the other side. But also at the same time, the bill was needed. I mean, I don't think, there's two aspects to this bill. People that stand on the center right would tell you that this bill just goes too far. It's government overreach in South Africa, just on steroids. But then people on the left, leaning far more left, they'll say that this bill doesn't go far enough.
Yeah.
Ultimately, this bill serves a practical use. And that is the reality that we need now to address spatial injustices that have existed in South Africa for plus minus 30 years in this country. Now, for us to address this realistically, government needs access to land where they can now build and improve the type of housing and spaces where they're going to build public facilities, railway infrastructure, or just housing, public housing, RDPs or what have you. That land, government can either buy or, as now the bill allows them to, if in the case the person they're trying to buy it from is being ridiculous during negotiations, wants a ridiculous price for it, the government can now go in there and take the land with nil compensation. The nil compensation is the most, I think it's the part that is most fought over, because my understanding is that they fear, and these are people that are vehemently opposed to this bill, they fear that this is the first step towards an EFF style expropriation without compensation bill, that there can be an arbitrary seizure of land in South Africa. Now, realistically, anyone who understands the law knows that's not going to happen. But, it's because it's detailed and complicated the way this bill operates. A lot of people didn't read the bill. they went off of the hysteria online, they went off of the fear-mongering, and the fact that I think perhaps the optics battle, because I think we also need to pay very close attention to the optics of this bill. The mention of expropriation in the name of the bill, maybe they should have called it the eminent domain bill, but the mention of the word expropriation there immediately, in normal people's minds, conjures up an image of Julius Malema at one of his rallies saying we're going to expropriate land in this country, irrespective of who owns it, where it is, however it is, we're going to own it all. And, it's a complicated formula that was turning in the country. And it just made it made the perfect opportunity for Trump to pounce.
Yeah.
Because we saw with Bella, there's already a well-oiled machine to misinform people about legislation in this country. We saw it with Bella, we saw it with NHI. I mean, there was a hell of a lot of misinformation around those two specific pieces of legislation. A lot of people were told things about those laws that were not true, just as now with the expropriation bill. The fact that it's now a point of contention in our international policy, I think we mustn't chalk it down to a failure of our government. We must now ask ourselves, is it actually a failure of having meaningful partners in the world? Because, let's be real. The president of the European Commission was here, and she was here to announce a new investment in South Africa. The president of France, Emmanuel Macron, was here not that long ago, a few years ago. These are two very big leaders in Europe who are asking the question, is America still a reliable partner? And that is a question we in South Africa must also begin asking ourselves. Is America a very reliable partner for us? Because you have a situation now where this one country seems to be the point of contention with so much of our foreign policy as an independent state. We can't pursue the ICJ because we're supposed to be a partner of America, but how does America's friendship with Israel, why should that have to have an effect on the way we conduct our own foreign policy as a sovereign state? It's just this continuous having to spread ourselves and lean more than we probably ought to in order to help keep that relationship afloat when their politics is disintegrating. I mean, in the United States, let's be very honest, it's taking a bipolar nature because you have a Biden administration that wants us to follow a pro-climate agenda that is very just transition, drive green energy, but now you have a Trump administration that is completely cancelling funding for that. I mean, you talk about the Just Energy Transition Partnership. That's billions upon billions of dollars and rands that we ought to be getting to facilitate our transition. Is that a reliable partner? Can we make agreements with America for 50 years knowing that we are going to be able to fulfill it? I don't think we have those guarantees anymore. We don't have those guarantees anymore. And the people need to decide for themselves in the court of public opinion, because I think that's where this ultimate fight is going to be adjudicated. I don't think it's going to be adjudicated in Parliament.
Yeah,
it's going to be adjudicated in the court of public opinion. People then need to decipher for themselves, is America still a reliable partner for us if they want to get involved in our domestic policy, but also at the same time are proven to be an unreliable partner in areas that matter for us on trade, infrastructure, on our ability to fulfill our own foreign policy. China doesn't really impose that much on us. They're very specific with one country in particular, Taiwan. Outside of Taiwan, they don't care. You can do whatever the hell you want, so long as you don't recognize Taiwan as separate to China.
Yeah.
Many parts of Europe, I think our relationship with our relationship with Russia makes Europe uncomfortable, but it doesn't still stop them from dealing with us as a partner and as a friend. But the United States, I think the end of the era of American exceptionalism is very hard on them. And they're trying to now press us into this position of, I don't want to say it, because I'm scared that if I say it, it becomes very controversial, but they're pretty much trying to father knows best us and then bully us into a position of conceding on every single point that makes South Africa South Africa.
Yeah.
And I'll end with this one point. There's a guy, I I can't remember his name, and I noted it here, but I can't remember his name. But he was talking about one of the main reasons why, in particular, Donald Trump's taken a specific point against us. And, they cite the ICJ and all of that. But we must also understand that this is a very different American president.
Yes.
He is very much viewing the whole world as part of his domain. He's not looking at America's borders. He's very much an America first president.
Yes.
He seemingly wants to do that whilst also imposing America's weight in the world. And his mentality is anything DEI is wrong, anything empowerment is wrong, anything in that vein of thinking is wrong. But you look at South Africa's laws. South Africa's laws are basically what he frames as DEI. But I think there is a very big difference in DEI the way he sees it in America and perhaps DEI the way we'd see it in South Africa. There it exists because you have a minority of the population which historically and still to an extent now is disenfranchised and left out of a huge part of the economy and the growing of America as a country. Here in South Africa, you have a minority of the population that has enormous influence and control over the economy and just South Africa in the direction that we're going. We see it in industry. We saw it with the markets when this whole dust-up started happening.
Yeah.
The unsettling isn't from black business saying, we don't know how that's going to hurt us. It's from white capital looking at this and saying, okay, but what does this mean for us now? Okay, what does this mean for our alliances and our friends in Europe? Or rather in America? And our policies exist because this huge imbalance is unsustainable and we need to begin addressing it. And this is very much, we mustn't be wrong about this. This is a backlash. This is an active backlash from forces within and outside South Africa to these diversity, these empowerment and transformation legislations that exist. But I don't want to keep yapping on this because I'm like, there's so much nuance to break into. But this whole race baiting thing, Rasool was not race baiting. He was stating purely the character that this government in the US has taken, and that is the same type of anti-diversity, anti-multiracial policy or politics in America that they are actively fighting against. They are now trying to export it. Because why else would you have an Elon trying to prop up the far right in Germany? Why would you have him trying to prop up the right in the UK? Why would we see Trump legitimize the argument of the unhinged right in South Africa? To an extent, we had dealt with these people. We didn't need to hear from them again. The Terra Blanches and the Connie Viljoen, I think it's Constad Viljoen. We had dealt with those forces to an extent, but now they've resurfaced with a lot more force and a lot more power, seemingly, because they now have a megaphone in the White House. And that's specifically what Rasool was trying to say as an ambassador. Whether a diplomat should be saying that, I think that speaks to the conversation as it unfolds further.
Yeah, I think two things. I think part of me is able to understand, particularly both having been in America and in South Africa, that white minority populations definitely do feel that they're under threat as a result of diversification, as a result of liberalism, as a result of social justice. And I think I can understand it. Do I agree with it? I think that's a separate conversation, but I think I can understand it. And I think it stands true that white Americans who have lost out, quote unquote, on the system because of DEI, because of these progressive policies that the United States has implemented, and they've kind of fallen away from the importance and the social hierarchy that they used to hold at the top. There's an element that they have been under attack, and Donald Trump is the person that's going to save them. And I think similarly in South Africa, especially when there's a mention to NHI, there's a mention to the Bella Bill Act and the Expropriation Act, I think when we look at who are the most likely affected communities, it tends to be Afrikaans communities. It tends to be the white communities because, as you said, they are the minority who tend to have access and control to resources. And so I don't necessarily find it hard to believe that it's being weaponized because we've seen it being weaponized and we're seeing it work around the world, as you've identified. I do think it does bring a question onto our element of understanding and to our questioning of how we engage in international relations. Because I think a very big conversation that's come out of this is whether or not these statements were correct for a diplomat to say. And under the context under which we were, I don't know where I stand on this, because I think there's an element of me that's able to recognize how the ANC's always dealt with the United States, with a great deal of skepticism. I mean, the United States was last to impose sanctions, I think, in 1985, so it's almost 40 years later.
Post 88, because they waited for the Berlin Wall to fall.
Yeah. And so you've got this element of we've never had a good relationship with the United States. Nelson Mandela was still on terrorist watch until 2008. The ANC and the United States have never known to have a formidable relationship. And as Ambassador Rasool does mention in his speech or in the conversation, he goes on to say that these aren't necessarily things that started with the Trump administration, but rather things that had been born within the Joe Biden administration because of our stance on Israel and because of what we were doing on an international stage. However, where the country was at that particular time, after an executive order, after the United States had pulled US aid, I still do question whether or not it was the responsible thing to do. Was it the right thing to do? I think certainly there's a capacity that understands within the ANC and within how they've related to the United States. There's been that skepticism. There hasn't been a healthy relationship, and there's always a teetering between whether or not we're on good standings with them or whether we're not. And also our establishment of BRICS and becoming a bigger voice within the global south, being non-aligned towards Russia, Ukraine. There's quite a plentiful of things that South Africa very much finds itself in contradiction with. With all that being said, as an ambassador, looking at the wider scope of where the country was, I do think there was an element to err for caution, because I think now more than ever, it's put South Africa in a divide. We've got many people who think it's going to be a heroic welcome, which the president has vehemently said actually he's reluctant to be in support of, and many saying that he said the right thing, and the country having half the population or some of the population thinking that he's a hero for what he's done, for standing up against such an imperialist force, supremacy force as he identified it. But there's the other side. There's the more conservative side, which says that we need more responsible ambassadors. We need people to engage America in a significantly more diplomatic way so that we can continue these relations. And with both of those things being said, it feels like now what used to be an external fight with the United States is now coming locally, and it's actually splitting our politics. And so I don't know where I stand on that as a statement, but I do want to say, I can say I see the reason, the validity, and why the statement was made. I think it was very objective. It was a recognition that just the white population in America is becoming a minority as a result of the influx of immigrants, the influx of other communities. But I do think there is something to be said about a country, but particularly a president who very much cares for everything that's said about him publicly, and especially in this time, that we could have erred on the side of caution. We could have been better, and we could have said, actually, though we do believe the statement, maybe it's not best said here. So, yeah.
I think fundamentally, we need to analyze, like you said, the historical relationship with America. It's not new for South Africa to criticize the United States as a partner in times when it's made very, not just strategically wrong decisions, but decisions that are morally reprehensible. So the Iraq invasion is a very good example of that. You had both former President Mandela and then President Thabo Mbeki calling out President Bush and our British partners and Prime Minister Blair for going into Iraq, saying this is unsanctioned, you don't have the information, give us a minute, give the world a minute to actually try work this thing out with Saddam. They weren't willing to listen, they went in anyway. We criticized them then. There was a lot of criticism on us for criticizing the Americans then, but ultimately, we were vindicated because we were on the right side of history, as we are again, because Ambassador Rasool was pointing out the character of this administration, the way in which they carry themselves out, and like I said earlier, the way in which they're using their domestic logic or their domestic ideology against pro-diversity, anything that builds multiculturalism or multiracialism as a character for a country. Their very deliberate effort against that. It's taking form in their domestic policy, and it's also taking form in their foreign policy. When the Secretary of State says he's not attending the G20 because the themes of the G20, equality, sustainability, solidarity, are basically DEI. Not understanding that there's a context behind this, that we live in a more interconnected world, and COVID really illustrated that to us. It shows that this is something deeper than just us. That you're challenging the themes of the G20, you're challenging these basic themes, you're challenging liberal parties or liberal democracies in other parts of the world. This isn't just dog whistle white supremacy that the US is taking. It's really a dangerous step towards changing the international norm around what is acceptable. Taking that one step further, I think we also need to ask ourselves what our moral duty is. Because it's very easy to say, oh no, we don't want to upset this guy. We don't want to upset this White House. But we must also understand that when you have a position of leadership or influence, such as the South African government does, and such as Ambassador Rasool does, with that position of leadership comes certain responsibilities. Now, is that responsibility to keep quiet when you see a character of a type of politics or diplomacy coming out of the White House that really could prove harmful to the majority of people on Earth? And when I talk about that, I'm talking about people in the global South, because you talk about these types of policies, the cancelling of USAID, it's impacting countries in the global South, most impoverished, most affected countries. Talking about that with climate change as well. This speaks to responsibility in such a moment, and that responsibility is to say, well, if this is happening now and this has taken this character, we should be speaking up about this, because I think people underestimate how quickly the world can fall into the type of authoritarian violence, ethnic violence and cleansing that characterized this period of history just a century earlier, except in Europe specifically. We can very quickly have a 1934 moment again if we don't speak up when we see things that are going in the wrong direction, when we see the wrong types of trends developing. And so I think the ambassador was right in calling out this administration and the way in which they've been carrying out their foreign policy and the way in which they've been carrying themselves out, because he, I think, analyzed the moment that there is a certain responsibility that those in elected or appointed leadership, such as his one, an ambassadorship, there's certain responsibilities that they have. And though diplomacy is the art of dealing with other countries without inflaming tensions, to a certain degree, you do have to put that element of diplomacy aside and call out a dangerous trend developing when it is developing, because that is part of his responsibility as a leader. Because otherwise, in the absence of that, and I'll again go back to 1934, we would have had a world of sympathizers to what was happening in Germany, rather than a world of countries that said, well, I wouldn't say they all specifically thought that what Germany was doing was wrong, but they specifically saw the trend lines of what Hitler was doing, and they said, no, we're going to challenge that fundamentally. And I think that's that moment again. And because South Africa is that country that seems to be speaking from the moral perspective, we're on the moral side when it comes to the ICJ, we're on the moral side when it comes to the situation going on in Congo right now, we're on the moral side of most arguments. It shouldn't be the onus is on us to then tiptoe around the US when we're on the right side of history. The onus should actually be on other countries that call themselves our friends and our partners to say, but South Africa's on the right side of this. America has repeatedly been on the wrong side of multiple issues, and South Africa can't be punished for daring to say the right thing, and calling out this administration in the way they're carrying themselves out is the right thing to do. They're doing wrong things. And the ambassador was just doing a very good job at perhaps meeting that. I feel that he was meeting that duty, that responsibility. I think that's the point that I think people are missing. Leadership has a responsibility and a duty. The ambassador met that responsibility and duty with this specific calling out.
I think Cyril Ramaphosa, when he calls for restraint to the celebrations of Ambassador Rasool returning home, it's a change in what the ANC has historically done. And I think it speaks quite significantly to the big question that's in forward and in front of this government. Do we choose our principles or do we choose our economy and being pragmatic, right? Because the big up and going conversation is, of course, the AGOA agreement. And that needs to be renewed at the end of this year. And that's a big controversy currently in this development of the United States-South African relations. But I think particularly when Ambassador Rasool says that he has no regrets, and he said we're all packed up and looking forward to returning to South Africa, there's an element of happiness. There's an element of this was a key moment in history, and this was a key moment in South African relations. However, you then contrast that with what the president has said, there seems to be an element of a change in the narrative, of a change in our belief in terms of how we approach diplomatic relations, but also how we approach international relations. And even now, with the construct of a new GNU, and even the DA explicitly coming out and saying that they want to be able to be part of the conversations of who's elected as the next ambassador, because the cabinet gets to decide who the next ambassador is. There's many different approaches that this government can take, and there's many different approaches that the ANC can take. And so within that, what that naturally creates is, firstly, one, a mass contradiction and fight that could become internal within the ANC about whether or not our principles ought to be the thing that we continue to forward, or we take a pragmatic approach. But within the wider GNU, that's also going to become a significantly larger conversation, especially if these relations go bad. And under the current construct of how these individuals have been involved and how Ambassador Rasool has played his role, what do you think is the best way going forward? If you were or what do you think people should be thinking for, what they should be looking out for going forward? Because in one element, I think there's so much to be said about, yes, South Africa can be on the right side of history. They can be the humanitarian country. They can be the non-aligned country as the ANC is in its policies and in its approach to international relations. But there's a growing concern and hysteria that's still being created that says this is going to be seen as the next big failure. This is going to be seen as the next big collapse in relations. That also happens in amongst a multipolar world that's rising. As you spoke about, the EU's coming out and engaging South Africa. China and Russia still continue to be big partners throughout BRICS. And you've got the United States. Is this the same point in time where we're now starting to choose our allies and we're actually gearing up for potentially something much bigger? And if that is the case, where does South Africa actually stand and how does it keep going forward, considering that it's involved in the Congo, it's involved in Palestine, it's involved in Russia and Ukraine? There's very few places that we actually get to avoid the United States. And even President Ramaphosa tried to clean up relations with the United States by saying that both them and the United States had the same ambitions for Ukraine. So there is an element of we still want to work with this power. We still want to have a degree of good relations. But then you get people like Mfikile Mbalula, SG of the ANC, saying that actually, no, this is neocolonialism. This is a form of imperialism. You can see that the conversations aren't aligned. And so where do you go, particularly as the ANC, particularly as the president of the country? And what do you do amongst these very uncharted waters where we're unclear as to what diplomatic relations are and we're unclear as to what the United States truly wants from us?
I think I'll address the politics element of this first. One of the worrying trends that's developed in the ANC is the inability to have these conversations in-house. It seems a developing trend in the parties to publicly adjudicate these problems. You have the president of the country saying one thing, who's the president of the ANC, but then you'll have the secretary general or the national chairperson say another thing, actively contradicting one another. I think these are conversations that need to happen in-house, and those types of problems that arise, ultimately now we see them spilling over into the way the GNU and the cabinet of the GNU is working out, where this type of a conversation should be happening within the walls of the union buildings. It should be happening within cabinet rooms. It shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't be hearing Helen Zille saying, no, Tony Leon should be the next ambassador to the US. You know, it should be a conversation that happens quietly and privately within government. So the political element here is that I think each party is trying to actually play towards where public opinion stands on this matter in terms of was this the right thing to do? Was this not the right thing to do? I think, I genuinely believe there's polling happening right now on this specific issue. I think my personal take in terms of where to go from here. I think fundamentally, each party comes to the government with its own agenda and its own objective. The ANC should not be trying to make it easier for the DA to get its way, and the DA should not be making it easier for the ANC to get its way, because ultimately each were elected upon their own mandate, though they've agreed to work together in a government of national unity. So ultimately, I think it should be ultimately what happens in most democracies in the world that have coalition governments. It should be a decision taken by government, by cabinet, but whichever member of the coalition that is able to muster up support within the cabinet for their specific candidate should get it. It's a lot harder in this specific case because there seems to be so much interference from outside forces to try. And when I say outside forces, I'm talking people in the civic space, people in the private sector, people in the international space to try sway this type of decision and the way in which we go. Ultimately, the ANC should not be trying to pander to any other party's candidate. The DA likes to moan and whine and complain that they haven't gotten their way in the GNU. They like to, that famous line, the ANC needs to remember that they didn't have the majority, okay, that they're governing with partners here. Yes, and you must also remember you're governing with a partner, the ANC, who's a bigger part of this coalition than you. They are gonna push their own agenda. Their job isn't to try work your agenda into their agenda. They're pushing their agenda in cabinet, and you must try push your agenda through as well. They can't be whining about NHI, Bella, and now the expropriation bill, saying the ANC's forgotten that they're governing in a coalition. The ANC is doing what the ANC wants to do in government. The question is, does the DA have the capacity now to use its force to get what it wants done in cabinet? So when it comes to the ambassador, I feel like that's where the fight is going to be. Will these guys actually show that they have the strength to force their will? Because in the absence of that, I started with this. It's not the ANC's job to make it easier for the DA to get its way. And the DA, obviously, it is not their job to make the ANC get their way easily.
Yeah.
So that is the challenge right now when it comes to this specific issue. Who's going to get their way, and will the other guys finally wake up to the reality that they now need to actually pressure and force their way? Because, within the ANC, the president and the deployees of the party in cabinet, they get a very clear mandate from the national executive of the party when they go for their meetings of the NEC, when they have their Lekhotlas, their NWC meetings, or when the NGCs come in, the National General Congress, one of the two. The mandate will be very clear to them.
Yeah.
You're going to go there. This is the type of foreign policy we're going to follow. This is the type of economic policy we want you to follow. These are the characteristics that should make up the portfolios that we hold. And these are the things we should try get done before 2029. What the DA said to them in cabinet is not going to come up at that NEC meeting. The members of the NEC do not care. That's what they want done, because that's what the party knows from its manifesto they said they were going to get done. So I think this is the reality. This is the moment when we'll see whether this is a real coalition. Whether, and I say that because in a real coalition, the dominant force has to give at some point. It has to give at some point, because the smaller, or rather in this case, the DA, they need to learn to use their weight. You have situations like in, trying to remember this country, but you had a situation in, I don't think it was Germany, but it was a European country where the prime minister didn't come from the party that got the largest amount of seats, but rather it was the party that had what they call the kingmaker number. And that's the number that got them across the line. That's a real coalition there, where the bigger forces now they swallow their pride and they decide to work with these other guys. In the UK, we saw it after the 2008 election, where Gordon Brown didn't get the numbers, and neither did David Cameron. They had to work with the Liberal Democrats. I think that's the name. The Lib Dems made the government at that time really meet a lot of what they wanted to get done. That's a real coalition. The partners can force and can use their weight. In the GNU, we aren't seeing that happening. I don't see the PA using its weight. I don't see the IFP using its weight. I don't see Rise Mzansi using its weight. I don't see the DA using its weight. They all whine. They all complain. But ultimately, I don't think anyone is in doubt that the ANC is running the show, because those are the policies that are coming out of government. And that's the answer to your question. I know for some people it doesn't feel like I've answered your question, but that is the actual answer.
Yeah.
Because you can't look at this from the diplomatic realm anymore. The appointment of this next ambassador is political. It's a political fight. And so it's a question of, will these guys have the power to use their political influence? Will they be able to use their weight? They've threatened to pull out. Will they follow through on it? They're threatening with the budget now. I almost see a reality where the DA caves on the budget, because the ANC tactfully is like, we want to get our way. Who on the table, or who of the options on the table in Parliament are there that can get us the vote to approve this budget? And the EFF has raised its hand. The DA can't complain. The ANC is finding an alternative. They too now must find a way to make their agenda work. If it comes with the budget or whether it's going to be with this ambassador. It's a political fight. And I don't think they actually are in it. I don't think they've actually caught on to it.
I think it's interesting that you say it's a political fight, because I think, once again, it's going to be local politics, especially in South Africa, and especially with the next big agenda item on this United States-South Africa dance that's happening currently on a global scale. Because I think you're right, the next appointment to some extent will be political. It will start defining who gets to be the first point of contact in the United States. It defines what diplomatic solutions are being proposed. It defines what's being shared with the United States government and who's leading those conversations. I do think, though, and I think this is where it's going to become difficult, is that you see, even at a domestic level, national government and metros not agreeing. So we've got Leila Khalid Drive, the proposal to rename Sandton Drive, which is also going to cause quite a great degree of tension. Considering that Leila Khalid was a Palestinian activist, she's very big and she's seen kind of as the face of Palestine activism at the moment, especially from the woman's side. That brings a lot of controversy to South Africa, because the US Embassy, the consulate, is on that road, which means the United States, in very many ways, is going to be somewhat linked to a Palestinian, which doesn't necessarily look good for them, but also would be very against all that's happened recently. I read a statement, and I forget for who it is, but it was in a News 24 article, who said, we want the US Embassy to have number one, Leila Khalid Drive. And I thought that meant so much, because it spoke of the political messaging that's present in South Africa. It spoke of the wave of social justice, fixing for the injustices of the past, that the ANC and South Africa have pushed quite significantly. But then we've got national government actually saying we shouldn't. We shouldn't increase tensions. We shouldn't change the name. We should probably be a bit more careful about how we approach this next conversation. And once again, I think, yes, it's a change in how we've done things historically, which I think for many South Africans will either be very hard to see, or this will be your first moment of celebration for the ANC as being conscious about how they want to approach global diplomacy. But I do want to ask, what do you think about the significance of the renaming of a specific road? And particularly at this time, what do you think about renaming it to a Palestinian activist, where the United States has so vehemently said this will be one of the next things that will break down the relationship between us? Because even from the State Department spokesperson, Tom Bruce, who said at the very least, what we should expect is a standard of some respect. Basic, low-level respect. If you're in a position that's going to help facilitate any kind of diplomatic relationship with another country. And now we've got, once again, these two governments coming to a head, And one government not showing the respect that they ask for in actively getting involved in the domestic policy of another sovereign nation, and the government trying to pander towards them and trying to maintain the relationship. How should we be navigating that? What's the view on that? Where should South Africans really be thinking?
I think this is one of the challenges of being a non-aligned country. Oh my goodness. This is a very tough one to answer because looking at it, I understand national government's reluctance because after the expulsion of Ambassador Rasool, the challenge now is navigating relations with the Trump administration. I want to differentiate the United States from the Trump administration.
Okay.
Because I feel, similarly to when he left the first time, when he leaves this time, there's going to be a sort of reversion back to the way we've been used to dealing with the United States, you know? Like when Joe Biden first got into office and he went to his first G20 or G7, he said, America's back. And then Macron responded, but for how long? You know?
Ooh, yeah.
So I think a differentiation being made there that this administration of Trump is different from the United States that we are used to dealing with, and the United States that we think we're going to end up dealing with at the end of this guy's 4-year term. Should a Democrat win or should a different type of Republican win, you know? So I think the reluctance of national government stems from that under any other administration, they probably would have done this. But with this particular one, they're thinking, okay, so how do we avoid another dust up with the Trump administration, not so much the United States of America? I think again, it's going to be a test of politics because it's seemingly the parties in support of this. The ANC is in support of this, but the national government, which is also the ANC at its national leadership level, is looking at this and is seeing it as a break of... I think they see this as a thing that breaks that veil of being a non-aligned country for us. Why I think that? I think the ICJ case was the first step towards a leaning on a line. Let me draw this picture. I think non-aligned countries specifically try not to take sides on really big contentious issues that really tend to indicate where you fall with the country. When it came to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we said we're a non-aligned country. You know, we're not going to side with the US and Western side, but we're also not going to fully side with Russia. We're just going to say we advocate for peace. That is our goal, like you said, President Ramaphosa said. But I think the taking of the ICJ case, the US saw it as, okay, you're no longer taking an unaligned position. You are taking an aligned position. And then I think that started the crossing of a threshold. And it still is the crossing of a threshold, this issue of Israel and Palestine. Because the United States very much sees Israel as a part of itself.
Yeah.
And any move seemingly against Israel is a move against the United States, and therefore you're no longer non-aligned. You have taken an aligned position. You are against us on this, and therefore, you know, they're a very binary way of thinking. You're against us on this, you're against us on everything. So I think that's where governments government's urge of caution comes from. Because you could take the ICJ case under a Biden administration, because that is a more rational administration. That one understands that you still have the power of sovereignty to make your own decisions and to undertake such things. But it seems with this administration, you don't have the option of going against America. You don't have the option of defying what President Trump wants. And you saw that in character when Volodymyr Zelensky was at the White House. He said, I don't want to talk with this man. He's still killing my people. He needs to leave this war first. I shouldn't be the one to concede here. And the administration very much saying, we want you to do this. You are going to do this. Very different in character from the way the US has previously tried to deal with its friends and partners. Hence why I say I differentiate Trump from the US. And I think that's where Pretoria's thinking is on this, is that the fact that the ICJ happened, the fact that the ICJ then led to an ICC, and the fact that that also led to warrants on Netanyahu, that perhaps this could be yet another step further that emboldens their opposition in Washington, that the Trump administration can then take fully to Congress and the Senate and say, it's not just the filing of the ICJ, it's the fact that even after we made it expressly clear to them that we don't want them following this issue, they went even further to stick it in our nose, and they should be pulled from AGOA. That's logically how where I see the air of caution coming from with government. That's why I said there's a confrontation that is trying to be forced here. There's a confrontation that's trying to be forced here. And that's why Pretoria is being very careful to not, in their own words, force a confrontation. The most aggressive we've said is we will not be bullied.
Yeah.
That's the most aggressive thing we've said. We don't want to force a confrontation. And I think Pretoria sees that there's a want to try force a confrontation in Washington. I'm not sure if you follow that. That's the way I see it. It's the way I see it because I'm like, no other way makes sense.
I definitely do believe in many aspects that, particularly what's happened, especially with statements like we won't engage in diplomacy, we won't engage in using the megaphone, we won't necessarily do the things that embolden the United States to give us a reaction, to react negatively, to tell us that we've done something wrong, was definitely a very clear and first step from the South African government to say we are actually going to be thoughtful about how we approach this next thing. I do think the last thing I want to say before we close out, and I think this might be a separate conversation in some ways, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and I forget about the third one, PayPal Mafia.
Yo, those guys.
3 South Africans, either lived in South Africa or born and lived in South Africa. One of the things that was mentioned was they grew up in a very different time. They grew up in apartheid South Africa, which was devoid of many of the social justice, social development, inclusion, equity, all the things that we're currently seeing in South Africa that dominate our discourse. Do you think the South African government needs to be doing more to create relations with Elon Musk, considering of how close he sits at the United States? Or do you think there's an element to they are part of the issue and they're fueling the fire? Because, of course, Elon Musk owning Twitter, X now as it's known, he's commented quite significantly on what's been happening on South Africa. And he's spoken about the fact that white farmers have been being killed and the need for there to be justice and for there to actually be protection for this minority group which is under attack. Peter Thiel, very big conservative, who's been very big in support and was one of the first big tech supporters to support Donald Trump publicly. These are people who have a strong vested interest in South Africa. Maybe for business reasons, maybe because it's where they've been, because it's where home is. We've heard the conflicts around Starlink, and we've heard the debates, and we've heard the issues there, and Elon Musk actively pushing for BEE to be removed. Is there an element of we're not considering the role that Elon Musk and his wider consulate of people have to play in South Africa? And then actually they might be the ones who might be mobilizing this attack in some forms. Of course, there's the ICJ, but this expropriation bill in particular seems to be the thing that mobilized them and took them over the edge.
It depends on their intentions. You know, one of my one of the best movies I've ever watched. I feel like it's a really great movie just because of the actor who depicts Winston Churchill, Gary Coleman. Forgot his name now. Of course, when I need to say it, I forget his name. One of the best scenes in that entire film is when they tell him, where he's depicting Churchill, that Europe is lost and they need to work with Germany. And he says, you cannot reason with a tiger when your head is in its mouth. If these guys, their intention, truly and honestly, is to roll back transformation, roll back inclusion and equity and justice in South Africa, roll back these core things that when you talk about addressing the historical inequalities of South Africa, you can't talk about dealing with these issues without transformation, without equity, without inclusion and policies that drive equality, both at a corporate and a social level. If they want to dispose of those policies in South Africa, they are positioned directly against the road the country needs to go to develop. Because fundamentally, everyone agrees the situation in South Africa is unsustainable. Everyone agrees the poverty, the inequality, the history of crime and violence, spatial apartheid, all of that has a lasting and an indelible and a visible impact on the country to this day, and it's manifested in the form and character of South Africa right now. Their agenda needs to be understood before our government can say we can work with them. Because you cannot work with someone who wants you to fundamentally remove the things that your country needs to survive or to make any form of progress. It is not going to be good for the country if we remove the policies that allow black and brown people into the spaces where they're able to participate, compete, improve their standards of living, and also from that, just there, address the underlying inequalities in our country. So if that's Musk and Thiel's agenda to remove these types of policies, then we can't work with them unless they're willing to compromise on that. Beyond that, I don't know. I think you need to sit with the people. I'd want to sit with them, look them in the eye, and get what they want. Because they clearly want something. You and I don't know what they want. No one can really predict what Elon wants. I think everyone's trying to understand, what does this guy want? No one can really predict it. But in the South African context, we don't know what they really want. We know how they're attacking, and we think that's what they want. But unless we understand what it is they're actually trying to achieve, we're not going to make any headway or progress. So Pretoria should go, sit with them, talk with them. I know the president met Elon Musk a few months ago. I think a more frank conversation needs to happen. I think we have leading business personalities in South Africa that can perhaps go on behalf of the government and talk to these guys and say, okay, what's your end game here? What do you really want? Because I think unless that frank and honest conversation happens, we are going to find ourselves in this back and forth relationship. And if what they really want is clear and cut against the interests of the country in terms of development, addressing the inequalities and the injustices in our society right now, we can't roll with that. And in that case, at least it's very clear. You're that side and I'm here. That clarity is needed. In this moment, I think.
I want to say, for our first one, thank you very much to you. It's been cool. We've been happy. I do think to the Elon Musk thing, definitely I think it'll be interesting to see what the agenda is. It'll be interesting to see how this thing unfolds. We'll be having the conversation. We'll be following the conversation. Ambassador Rasool arrives today at the day of this recording, so hopefully we get to understand what that means. But to everyone else who's come, I want to say thank you very much. This is the beginning of many more. It's the beginning of more conversations with South Africans. It's the beginning of speaking truly about politics and the way politics should be spoken about, from the youth, through the youth, by the youth. So we want to say thank you for coming through. Mr. Nkadimeng, thank you for being my co-host, and I'm so happy for this new partnership. And to everyone, this has been Born Free. Thank you.